Can you mix vocals with only 2 plugins? In today's video, we're gonna find out. I've got an AfroFusion vocal here that I've already comped, edited, and roughly balanced in my mix. Standard stuff before starting to build a vocal chain, and this is what it sounds like to start.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
And while it's in a decent starting place, I think it could use a little bit more love. And if you've watched my past videos, like my drill vocal chain video, you know that I've at times relied on upwards of 8 plugins to dial in my vocal sound. But in today's video, we're gonna be setting up some constraints so that we exclusively rely on 2 plugins or 2 processes rather than 8. So which 2 plugins am I gonna use in this video, you might be wondering? Really, you, me, and anyone that's good at mixing should be able to make a vocal sound amazing with just 2 processes, an EQ and a compressor. These 2 plugins alone, especially when used strategically, can replace many specialized plugins like a de-esser, for example, and ultimately achieve a high fidelity sound like what we're going to arrive at by the end of this video, which I'll give you a preview of right now.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Not bad, right? So my promise to you is that by the end of this video, you'll have a better idea of how to incorporate these 2 processes into your vocal mixing with more intentionality while achieving great sounding results that'll impress your listeners. So now let's discuss how I would approach building a vocal chain using these 2 plugins only. And for that, I'm gonna be specifically relying on the Dynamic EQ and the Intuition Compressor from AIX DSP. If you're interested in checking these plugins out, I'll leave links to them down in the description below, but otherwise you should be able to replicate what I'm going to show you with any EQ and compressor plugin out there. I just happen to like these 2, and you're gonna find out why throughout the rest of this video as well. So to start, I'm gonna work with an instance of the Dynamic EQ as mentioned first. My goal with this EQ is to clean up the vocal, reduce any problem spots, and sculpt it as a whole into something that sounds more high-end. This process will be purely subtractive for now, and then later we could talk about enhancing the vocals with an EQ as well. So to do that, I'm gonna first use the filter that's built into this EQ to reduce any low-end frequency buildup, particularly removing any unintelligible frequencies that are not adding to the vocal or enhancing it in any way. Doing this will ultimately help clean up the vocal and prevent it from becoming too muddy. It'll also have the benefit of making some room for the lower-end elements that should be more dominant in the low range, such as the kick and the bass and anything else that lives down there. Now, the trick is, as we do this, we don't want to remove too much because otherwise we're going to create a thinner sounding vocal, and that also works against our cause. We want to find the perfect middle ground between cleaning it up and reducing what is necessary and not really noticeable, at least in context, but without totally altering the sound of the vocal and making it too thin. I personally like to do this by playing the track, sweeping the filter to the right, therefore removing frequencies, and listening for the place where the vocal really changes in a drastic way. And then from there, once I find that spot where it changes drastically, pulling it back to the left and making sure that I'm not removing too much, essentially giving it some slack so we're cleaning it up, but without going too far. I just need to find that point where it's too far first in order to know what to remove.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So this seems to be pretty decent here. It's actually quite high, around 105. And in general, I find that I'm usually filtering out somewhere between 50 and 100 hertz. It really depends on the vocalist, obviously, but right here seems to be pretty good. When I pushed it too far, beyond 100, we're starting to really thin the vocal out, whereas here we're cleaning it up in just enough of a way while preserving the presence, at least in my opinion. Now, with the low cut in place, we can now turn our attention to higher up in the frequency range. And me personally, I like to listen to the vocal, and and identify other frequency problems that are present. I specifically want to understand if the vocal suffers from any of the common problems that may present themselves in a vocal mix. And some questions I might ask myself is the vocal muddy? Is it boxy? Is it harsh? Is it nasally? Is there too much air, high-end presence? These are all factors that might present themselves, and they're not always going to be there. It's really going to depend on the vocalist, but your vocal might be suffering from one or more of these problems, and we're going to want to treat them. Now, with this vocal in particular, I find it to be a little bit boxy sounding, and I know the artist is recording in a tighter, smaller room, which can obviously emphasize some of these frequencies at times. One of the benefits of this plugin is I could solo a frequency, create a tighter cue, and then sweep around to find the exact problem spot, which is what we're going to do together. And again, knowing that this is a boxy sound, this is going to be somewhere in the low mids, probably somewhere between 200 and 600 or 700, depending on the vocalist once again. So let's play this and find this problem spot.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah.
So that's definitely the frequency that I'm hearing in my head. And of course, my ears are tuned because I've been doing this for a while. You just got to continue to practice if you're not able to identify things as quickly, and you will eventually get it over time. But now what I could do, which is interesting, is I can actually mute this band, and that'll help me understand if this is really a problem. Because if I mute it and it goes away and it creates another problem, maybe I don't need to treat this. But if it cleans up the problem, even if it's in a drastic way, then I know it's right. Let's try it out.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So it's not the worst frequency, to be honest. When I mute it, it sounds fairly natural, obviously a bit affected. When I put it in, it's not a huge difference, which is probably a good thing. But I definitely could tell that it is cleaning things up, and we probably need to find a middle ground between the two extremes of completely removing it versus having it fully in at the current level that it's at. So with that in mind, we can actually make an adjustment. Now, while I can absolutely go in with the gain and just take this out with a static move, that kind of defeats the purpose or the benefit of this plugin. This plugin is a dynamic EQ, and you may have noticed that up here in the top right side of the plugin, there is a compression interface, which is going to be very useful for us to transparently treat problems, because as you can imagine, sometimes a frequency problem is not always present. Sometimes it's only there at certain times, and other times it is not. And a dynamic EQ, or at least a band like this, is going to allow us to reduce a problem when it's a problem, as determined by the threshold we're going to set in a moment, rather than statically take it out all the time, especially during key changes or changes in the song where the performer alters their cadence and their tonality. Maybe that frequency that we're taking out statically is suddenly necessary, and having this as a dynamic move will therefore not allow that to be such a problem when those key changes happens, because it's not going to affect the frequency range when those moments happen. It'll be smart enough to know not to take that down. That being said, let's set up a band here. The first thing I need to do is turn on the compressor. So I'm leaving my gain at 0. It's not being altered. And instead, I'm going to be using the compressor here to address this. Now to start, I'm going to set my attack and release to be very fast. And I am going to have this source be on the band itself rather than a sidechain, although you can absolutely have a sidechain trigger this as well. And now from here, we're going to want to set our ratio. I'm going to set this to a 2-to-1 ratio. If I leave it at 1-to-1, there's going to be virtually no gain reduction taking place, whereas at least once I go past 1-to-1, maybe to 1.5 or 2, which are subtle ratios, lower ratios, they'll sound more transparent and produce a reduction. Now the last thing we got to do is play the track and set our threshold. As I set this, you're going to see this band actually start to actively or dynamically work to reduce the material, and you can see here that it says 6 dB, 12 dB, so we can actually kind of gauge how much of a reduction is taking place. I'm going to use my ears above all else. Let's try it. Here we go.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
That sounds pretty good. It's obviously cleaning things up, certainly thinning things out just a little bit, but I think once we put this back into context, it's going to sound fine and dandy. So now that we have this set up with an initial reaction, we can actually set these parameters up or adjust them to achieve a more transparent effect. And this is one of the main benefits of this dynamic EQ over something else like a FabFilter Pro Q3, for example. It's that it gives you access to the attack, the hold, the release, and various parameters that a lot of other dynamic EQs do not. not, at least not consistently. This is a key reason why I said I like multiband compression more than dynamic EQ, because every multiband compressor is going to give you access to these parameters, and multiband compressors and dynamic EQs function very similarly, so you can technically achieve a very similar effect with either one, but the multiband always gives you that benefit of giving you access to the attack, the release, and other parameters, whereas a dynamic EQ, some of them do, some of them don't. If every dynamic EQ was like this one and came with that access, I'd probably even actually choose the dynamic EQ over a multiband compressor, because I can be even more precise with my adjustments on a frequency level, narrowing the Q to a very small level, whereas the multiband obviously will function and focus on an entire band, and there's a limitation to how small you can make that band at the same time. So obviously this is why I like using a dynamic EQ if it comes with the parameters like this. That being said, I'm probably going to leave my attack fairly quickly, but I may want to slow down my release just to produce a smoother reduction effect. Let's play it and see what we can do.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So that seems pretty good to me here with the slower release. It's obviously not the slowest it can be, it's more on the medium side of things, and I definitely left the attack pretty quick, so I do want these frequencies to clamp down, but of course if you find it's too much, you can always delay it with the attack. Now I am not using the hold, I don't want it to hold the frequencies down, I actually want it to be fairly dynamic. That's the benefit of this process, is that it breathes and moves, so it feels a little bit more natural in that regard, rather than a static reduction. So I'm not using it here, although you absolutely can if you want. Now another issue that I hear on this vocal is that there tends to be some nasally moments, and that's a pretty common problem with a lot of vocalists, to be honest. Now this nasally range is typically somewhere between 900 and 2K, although of course it's going to depend on the vocalist once again. So just like before, we can solo the frequency, sweep around, and find the place where that nasally frequencies in particular live.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah.
So somewhere around here, 1060 hertz seems to be where there's a lot of that nasally range. We also want to be careful here though, because there is a lot of presence and intelligibility in this area. So if we completely remove it, we could potentially kill it and make the vocal less intelligible. So we want to make a very strategic move here. And this is another great situation to use the dynamic bands to reduce the presence of this frequency when it becomes too overwhelming, when it pokes out too much. Now, just like before, I'm going to turn this on, and something I want to point out to you, even though I'm not going to use it in this video, is this is not just a compressor, but also a downward expander and an upward expander. So this is a very versatile solution, because you can not only compress a band and reduce it when it's too much, but you can also expand it, meaning I can increase the level when it passes a threshold, or the opposite, I could decrease the level when it's not passing a threshold, and effectively increase the dynamic range, if that makes sense. That being said, just like before, I'm going to speed up the attack and release. I'll leave the hold to 0. I'm going to bump up the ratio to 2, and I'm going to bring down my threshold until I start to see a reaction, and I'm going to listen to make sure that it's cleaning things up effectively.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So it's definitely cleaning things up, and now we can go ahead and adjust our parameters once again. I usually do like to slow down the release just to make sure things sound smooth, and I may potentially slow down the attack in this case, because you can see I'm getting quite a big reaction, and it's hard to find the sweet spots sometimes. If I increase the threshold or decrease it, I find I'm either getting too much or not enough, so I'm going to be able to use these to sculpt this further. Let's try it out.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So that sounds a little bit better. Sounds a bit more transparent, not too aggressive. Now, something you may have noticed up until this point, and I certainly have, is there's quite a bit of sibilance and harshness on this vocal that we want to treat. And a lot of times we'll reach for something like a de-esser for this, but a de-esser is just a specialized tool that we can easily replace with a dynamic EQ. In fact, a dynamic EQ might be even better than a de-esser depending on how we set it up. So in this case, the first thing we want to do is, once again, use a band to identify and figure out where the sibilance is living. So I'm going to solo this band, create a tighter cue once again, and try to find that. And typically sibilance lives somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000, although again, depends on the vocalist, but let's see what we can find here.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Definitely sounds like this is roughly the pocket at 5,600 hertz, and you can even tell because the peak here actually is a little bit higher than everything else. Looking at the amplitude can definitely be a good indicator of if there's too much presence of a certain frequency. So to make this interesting, we can do a couple of things. First of all, I'm actually going to press the mute button here and just see how does this affect the vocal. Is it clearing up that problem to fully confirm that I have the right frequency selected?
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah.
So a lot of sibilance there, and it's just definitely quelling it, although it definitely sounds a bit unnatural. So obviously fully muting it is going to be too much of a move, and it's not really a move I would do anyways. I'm using this just to confirm what's happening. So instead what I'll do is I'll probably do a combination of a static move, and then I'll add the dynamic band as well, just to see if we can treat it even more, especially when certain parts pop up. One of my favorite strategies to treat a problem is to actually fully notch it out and then slowly introduce it back until I find a place where it sounds fairly natural. So let's do that.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby.
So about a 3 dB move seems to be pretty okay here. And now we could stack a dynamic band on top of it. So even though we're notching out 3 dB, when it potentially exceeds the threshold we're going to set, it's going to actually duck it even more and reduce even more of that harsh frequency. So since I've shown you how to do that, I'll just quickly set this up. And now let's play it and dial in our threshold.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no baby.
So it's obviously a pretty aggressive move, you could see, but it's also really only tackling this frequency when an S is happening. When that S happens, it's ducking it quite fast. So now to make it sound a little bit more natural, a little less jumpy, we could slow down the release time. Here we go.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah.
Definitely smoothing things out and making it less harsh. So right now I think we've done the appropriate amount of treatment. Obviously there could be a variety of problems on your track, but these are the ones that I caught in this one here, and I wanted to treat them first before moving into my compression stage. Before we talk compression, something I want to point out that this EQ does really well is it gives you access to an input and output gain stage. I can adjust the incoming signal when it goes into the EQ, and then I can also address the signal and change the level of it when it goes out of the EQ after processing. And because we've done a lot of different moves here, both static and dynamic, there's a good chance that the volume has changed from where we started and where we ended up. And now I want to use this gain, especially this output gain in particular, to better match the level that we started with before moving into compression. So let's check out and see what levels are we hitting before and after throughout the entire verse.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So as expected, the incoming signal is at 14.7, whereas the outgoing signal is actually lower. It's 3 dB lower at 17.7. So we got a 3 dB difference between where we started and where we ended up, and that just makes sense because, again, of all these changes that we've made. So we can add some level to our output signal to compensate and try to better match where we started before moving into compression. And even though we're losing 3 dB, chances are this is way too much. This is the maximum amount that we've lost, and it's probably not the average. We want to try to find the average volume loss. So what we're going to want to do is play this, bypass, and put it in, and try to just match it with our ears first and foremost. Let's do that.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So in this case, I'm adding back 1.1 dB, and when I bypass the EQ and put it in, obviously there's a tonal difference, but at the same time, the level difference seems to be matched, at least to my ears listening on speakers. So this seems to be most appropriate. So now let's shift gears and talk about compression. This is the Intuition compressor here, and really I'd say it has everything you could possibly need from a compressor. That includes all of the standard parameters you'd expect, like a threshold, ratio, attack, hold, and release, as well as makeup gain. But it also has a built-in auto gain feature. It has a built-in limiter with a threshold, so you can stack limiting on top. And you can further sculpt the sound by addressing the punch setting, which is a unique setting to this plugin that essentially delays the attack stage, as well as controlling the knee, making it hard or soft, adding a look ahead time, and even addressing the RMS, which is actually going to change how this compressor functions and make it work a little bit more similar to how our ears work. If you've been listening so far, you can tell this vocal is already fairly consistent, but there's certain transient peaks that are poking out and ultimately require a little bit of treatment. We can use a compressor to ultimately tame these peaks, and in the process of doing so, we can add gain back to make up for the volume we're losing. This will ultimately benefit the quieter parts that aren't affected by the compressor at all, and ultimately create a more consistent sounding track. This will really benefit the track by making it just translate better across different mediums, different listening devices, and also help the vocal sit better within the beat and instrumentation that's around it. So with that being said, let's get some starter settings going, and I've already got this set up, but make sure you have a fast attack and release time, which we'll adjust later. We can set our ratio to 2:1, which is a transparent or more subtle ratio. It's not going to be as aggressive as a higher ratio, and I've reset my threshold to 0. For now, I'm going to leave my knee all the way to the left, which I believe is the hard setting. I'm not going to use look ahead because I don't want to delay the signal at all, although you can to better treat the transient peaks if you desire. I'm not going to use the RMS or the punch functions in this case. These are unique to this compressor, but we'll avoid them for now, maybe dial them in later. And I'm going to leave the mix at 100, and I'm also going to leave makeup gain off. I'm also going to disable the auto gain for now, and I'm going to leave the limiter and threshold where they are being off and with no setting. Now, interestingly, this also has a few different modes: feed forward, feedback, and bus. I'm going to use the feed forward mode in this case. I'm applying it to a vocal directly, so I want to just focus on that. And from here, we can now address the vocal itself. And what's great is this interface. When I play this, you're going to actually see the waveform populating, and I'm going to be able to actually address the threshold in real time. You're going to see it come down, and I'll be able to set this perfectly. So let's try.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah.
So this seems to be a good place to start, and hopefully you could see it was showing you the gain reduction for each part. So every time the waveform was moving, you could see the reduction up top, and I can actually quantify that reduction here. But this is obviously just a great tool to visually see exactly what you're doing, which most compressors do not have or do not provide. That being said, we're losing upwards of 4.5 dB at times, so now we can actually sculpt our attack and release settings, and you can actually hear there's a little bit of distortion sort of happening because because of how fast I have these settings. So I'm going to slow them down to create a more transparent reduction. And even though I'm losing 4.5 dB, I really want to set this up in a way where I'm losing maybe closer to 2 to 3 on average, especially for those loud peaks. So let's do this right now.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So this is already starting to sound better. Sounds a little bit less distorted and obviously cleaning things up, smoothing it out. And I think something we can do now to extend that is to use the knee functionality here. So right now I have a hard knee. If I move it to the right, we're gonna be able to soften this knee up a little bit. And you're just gonna see how that obviously affects the signal in a moment, but it should produce a smoother sound.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So moving towards this softer setting, you can hear now how much smoother the compression becomes, whereas with that harder setting, the vocal is a bit more harsh and forward. Of course, if I make it too soft, it's going to really smooth things out and dull it in a way, so I need to find that sweet spot in between, which I think I've got now. Now at this point, we can play around with the punch setting, which is unique to this compressor, and this is ultimately going to just add a hold time before any compression is applied, which is before the attack stage triggers the compressor, and ultimately I want to add just a few milliseconds to this in order to emphasize the vocal a little bit more and ultimately achieve that punch that it promises. But again, I don't want to push this too far because then it might undo what we've done so far. So let's do this gently and delicately.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So this quicker setting seems to be pretty good, and you can tell when I pushed it, it obviously was delaying the compression a little bit, which was resulting in less gain reduction taking place and just a different sound. Again, I don't want to go crazy here, I don't want to undo things, so this setting seems to be appropriate. So now let's talk makeup gain, and we have two options here. We can manually add it back with the makeup gain function, or we can use the built-in automatic gain compensation. Me personally, I like to use the automatic gain compensation where I can, as it's going to give me a little bit more of an accurate control and add the right amount of volume back to the parts, as it's going to happen more so dynamically and not just statically. Makeup gain, I'm going to be adding that volume regardless. The automatic gain compensation is going to sort of add that volume back in different intervals depending on what exactly is being lost or reduced in the process. So let's hear what it sounds like with the automatic gain compensation.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Just as promised, you could hear how it's increasing the volume, especially when I remove this function altogether, and you can obviously hear it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's compensating for the volume losses that are taking place throughout this compression process. Now, if we want, we can also use the limiter that's built into this compressor, and it comes with two settings, a soft and a hard setting, which will add a different texture and ultimately treat the peaks in a slightly different way. This limiter is going to essentially flatten the track aggressively, and that'll ultimately increase the consistency and produce a more forward vocal sound. However, it's also going to drastically reduce the peaks, which may not necessarily be desirable as well. For that reason, we won't use it today because I think we're achieving a good amount of compression and improving the vocal's presence and consistency so far. However, you can imagine how useful having a built-in limiter can be, especially if I was applying this to a group or a master track instead of a vocal. That being said, if you want to see me break down how I use limiters on vocals, I'll leave a link to a video up above and down in the description below for you to check out after. So based on where we are, the vocal actually sounds pretty good, but if we play this again, we can pay attention to our input and output signal and see how different they are from one another. See if the output is louder or quieter than where we started.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Now in this case, there actually is quite a difference. The input's at minus 16.6, but the output is at about 14.5, so it's actually about a 2 dB difference, being the output signal is 2 dB louder than where we started. And this might be perfectly okay, but in my case, I want to use the built-in output slider once again, just like I did with the dynamic EQ, to just quell this a little bit and make sure that it's sitting in line with the rest of the track. So I'm going to simply play this and just rebalance my level right here and try to match where we started.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So in this case, I've actually reduced it a little bit more by about 3 dB. And even though now technically it's a bit quieter than where we started, you could hear the difference in presence thanks to the compressor. The compressor is obviously evening things out, creating that consistency. And in the process, it's sort of changing the frequency relationships a little bit. And that's something we're actually going to talk about next. But overall, I think this is sitting where it needs to sit and it sounds good so far. But as I mentioned, there's a couple of frequency-specific problems, and this is not unusual. Usually after I compress a vocal, it'll sort of bring out certain frequencies. We've pre-treated them in the first step with that dynamic EQ, but now we need to actually do a little bit of additional EQ, but I am cheating a little bit in the sense of I'm going to have two instances of the EQ, one before the compressor and one after. But the main reason why I want to use a second instance of the dynamic EQ is to further sculpt the vocal, clean up some of the problems that have now come up as a result of using compression, and then also enhance anything that needs to feel a little bit more present. The reality is, even though compression tends to level out a track and make it more consistent, it can also make certain frequency pockets more pronounced and therefore require additional treatment. In this case, and in most cases, I find that the low end in particular comes up after the compression, and therefore we'll want to manage that low end once again with this second process. And that means that the first thing that I'm going to do is once again use the built-in high pass filter or low cut filter to reduce the low end presence that has come up as a result of using the compressor first and foremost.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Now that move alone is already cleaning things up quite significantly, and you can tell that I've used a slightly steeper Q here in order to make sure that I am focusing very much on those low frequencies below 76 Hertz in this case. Now, similar to where we started, I do feel like there's still quite a bit of that muddy boxy area, so I am going to want to use a band here to dynamically treat that when it becomes a problem. So let's do that.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah.
So already that's smoothing things out quite a bit. And now we can look at another problem that I'm hearing, which is just that continued nasally presence in that upper mid-range. I want to just continue to quell that and make sure that it doesn't poke out too much, but of course without affecting the intelligibility of the vocal, just to clean it up. So let's do it again quickly since you now understand the process I'm going to work through.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So that seems to be cleaning things up. And now we could talk about the final range I want to treat, which is once again that upper range that's harsh and sibilant. I think it's still a problem, still poking out, and I want to just continue to address it after the compression stage. So let's do that.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Now that seems to be pretty good. Notice how I've used a slightly lighter ratio being a 1.5 to 1. But now let's talk about enhancements, something that I haven't brought up until right now. There's a few areas I think we can enhance to really add some emphasis to the vocal. And the first is going to be somewhere in the low end, not where we cut, but a little bit lower to just add a little bit of warmth and thickness. Now I find this is typically somewhere between the 100 and 200 range, and we're just going to add a slight static boost to increase the emphasis of the low end in the vocal, and that'll help it just feel a little bit bigger and fuller. And I say this because I've done a good amount of filtering and treatment correcting problems, and I know when I put this into context, it's probably going to sound just a little bit thinner. So to compensate for that, I'm going to add back some low end presence between 100 and 200 hertz with a bell. Let's try it out.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
That feels better, warmer, thicker, and just more appropriate overall. Now the other area that I think worth adding to is the high end, particularly above 8 kilohertz. I don't want to go too crazy because if I add a lot, it might make the track sound brittle. However, I do want to open up the vocal a little bit, and I know that a nice high shelf boost in particular can typically achieve that. So let's try it.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
That's quite a difference in presence. So now let's do a final comparison without this vocal chain and then with it, and we can ultimately see how far the vocal has come from where we started.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby
that's quite a big jump. You can hear how much more high-end and consistent the vocal sounds, even with just a few simple processes as I've shown you. And it certainly helps that the tools that I've been using are high quality and very flexible. And that's why these offerings from AIX DSP stand out over some of their competition, especially ones that are charging way more for less functionality. So do yourself a favor and try out these plugins instead of their more expensive alternatives. Now you might be thinking, what about effects, reverb, delay, and all of that good stuff that adds that lush ambient vibe to a track? Don't you worry, I got you covered with this video right here where I break down 7 essential vocal effects I use in every mix. Don't forget to smash that like button blue if you got value out of the video, and definitely subscribe for more mixing tips in the near future. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I look forward to helping y'all again soon. Peace.
5